In this video, we're going to talk about metabolism and bioenergetics. So first of all, let's talk about this concept of metabolism. And the definition of metabolism is just all of the chemical reactions that occur in a living organism. And we can further break down metabolism into two different kinds of reactions. There's anabolism, which involves building new molecules, and catabolism, which involves breaking down molecules. So an example of anabolism would be taking monomers and sticking them together in order to make a polymer or a macromolecule. So we could write that out as monomer plus monomer gives you a polymer. And these polymers, we can also typically refer to them as a macromolecule. And a more specific example would be something like taking a monosaccharide and attaching it to another monosaccharide. And there would typically be more than just two involved, but I'm just drawing two here for an example. And that would give us a polysaccharide, which would be a complex carbohydrate. And as it says here, there's usually an input of energy required. So there would be energy going into this reaction to allow for these bonds to be made between the monomers and the other monomers to make the polymer. So we could also kind of show this using, I'm just going to use some circles. So let's pretend like this is a monomer. This is another monomer and another one. So each one of these is a monomer. And then they make a polymer, which is just all of them connected together. And then, of course, energy is needed in order to form those bonds. Now, catabolism is kind of the opposite of anabolism. So it would be taking those polymers and breaking them down into their monomers. So a specific example would be taking something like a protein and breaking it down into its amino acids. And there's typically a release of energy in this process. And this relates back to cellular respiration. So your body, your cells are able to do cellular respiration where they take nutrients, they break bonds of those nutrients in order to ultimately make a molecule or more of ATP. In order for these metabolic reactions to occur, there has to be an input of nutrients. And the main nutrients that we can get energy from are going to be the carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. So these are the ones that are involved in being able to make energy. Or I guess not make energy, but convert energy from the energy formed in the chemical bonds and convert that into the energy stored in ATP. We also get raw materials. So for example, we need to get those building blocks. Which we can also call those monomers. So for example, when you eat protein, your body catabolizes the protein and it might extract some energy, so we make some ATP in the process. But we also take that protein and we break it down into amino acids. Our cells can then take those amino acids and put them back together, potentially in a different order, to form a different protein. So we need the carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins for energy and raw materials. We can also use nucleic acids, We don't get energy from nucleic acids, but we do get those building blocks. So, for example, when your cells need to go through mitosis, they first have to replicate their DNA so that each new daughter cell produced is going to have a set of chromosomes. But in order to make new DNA, the cells need nucleotides in order to make a new strand of DNA. And you get those nucleotides from eating other living cells and taking the nucleic acids, breaking them down into their monomers, and then your cells put them back together in order to form a new strand of DNA. Oxygen is also needed, and this is needed for that aerobic cellular respiration. And that is needed to make the ATP. During these metabolic chemical reactions, we also have some waste products that are produced. And these are things like carbon dioxide, but also things like uric acid and urea, and just these other waste products that are produced when these molecules are broken down. And these need to be able to be removed from the cell and then ultimately removed from the body as well. I want to do a quick review of macromolecules here. This is a concept that you should have learned in a previous biology course, but I talked about them a lot on the previous slide, and I just want to make sure that you really understand what I was talking about. So macromolecules, macro means big. They are also sometimes called biomolecules. And some of them are polymers, but not all. There's one exception to that. And these are the molecules that essentially all living things are made up of, or I guess I should say the organic molecules. So all of these are organic. And organic just means that the molecule has carbon and hydrogen in it. All right, so there are other inorganic compounds that also make up living things, but these are the four main classes of organic compounds that are associated with living organisms. And so we can look at their monomers. Mono means one, and these are also kind of considered like the building blocks. And then we can take a look at the polymers, which are the macromolecules. And I'll separate this out here. There we go. All right, so the first one we will talk about are the monosaccharides. All right, so these are the simple sugars. Examples include glucose and fructose. And when they are stuck together, so think of these as they're kind of these individual rings. They actually look kind of like a little hexagon. Their molecular formula does. So imagine that these are, little rings, and then the polymer is going to be a polysaccharide. Also known as a complex carbohydrate. And it just consists of multiple monosaccharides bonded together. The next one we'll talk about are proteins. And so a protein is a macromolecule, and it is made up of monomers known as amino acids. All right, and once again, think of the amino acids as their own kind of smaller molecule, and the protein is just a whole bunch of amino acids bonded together. The next one, we'll take a look at nucleic acids. And this includes things like DNA and RNA. And they are made up of the monomers known as nucleotides, which include guanine, cytosine, adenine, thymine, and uracil. And then last but not least, we have the lipids. And lipids are a little bit different in that they don't follow this kind of traditional monomer polymer situation that we've been talking about. So lipids come in a couple of different varieties. We are primarily going to focus on the triglycerides. But other examples are things like the phospholipids associated with the cell membrane. And then steroids, which include things like cholesterol and some hormones. And steroids are kind of their own thing structurally. But if we take a look at triglycerides and phospholipids, I'll put a little star there. They typically have a glycerol molecule attached to some fatty acids, or fatty acid chains, we'll say. All right, so when I was talking about metabolism and I was talking about anabolism, which would be taking these monomers and sticking them together to make a polymer. So anabolism would essentially be doing a chemical reaction in this direction. And catabolism would be the opposite. So it would be taking a polymer and breaking it down into its monomers, and it would be proceeding in this direction. And remember that these reactions are exchanging energy, so transforming energy from one form to another. We are also taking complex polymers, breaking them down into their monomers so that our cells can then take the monomers to build other additional macromolecules. So now let's talk about how different body shapes and sizes can be kind of limited due to metabolic requirements. So unicellular organisms, and uni means one, so these are single-celled organisms, they have to be small, all right? And the reason for that is because all of the exchange of nutrients and gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide and waste have to be able to get through the cell membrane into all parts of the cell through diffusion. So if this were our unicellular organism and we had nutrients trying to get in, they have to be small because the nutrients have to be able to get to all parts of the cell so that the cell can use those nutrients. The waste products also have to be able to fairly efficiently get out of the cell. As cell size increases, something called the surface area to volume ratio decreases, and this is a problem. So basically, if a cell gets too big, then there's not enough surface area for there to be nutrients or not enough surface area for nutrients and waste products to diffuse across the cell membrane fast enough to get to all different parts of the cell. And I'm going to post a link to another video that better explains this concept. It's a concept you should have learned in a previous biology course, but if you don't remember this, you might want to watch that video to get some review. So this limit with the surface area to volume ratio means that larger organisms have to be made of more cells, not larger cells. All right, so as an organism gets bigger, there's a limit to how big that cell can get. And so instead, there have to be multiple cells. And these cells differentiate and turn into specialized tissues and organ systems. Sorry, there's supposed to be a comma there. And these tissues and organ systems help to essentially deliver nutrients to all of the cells that need them and get rid of waste products. All right, so larger organisms need to be multicellular. They need to have more cells, and it's because of this surface area to volume ratio. Because as the cell gets bigger, there's less surface area per unit volume, which makes it less efficient for substances to get in and out of the cell and to diffuse to all different parts of the cell. So imagine if we take a look at this kind of small unicellular here, and then let's just draw a bigger cell next to it, you can see how it's a lot faster and easier to get to the middle of the smaller cell than it is to get to the middle of the larger cell. So you can see how it's more efficient to be smaller as a cell as opposed to larger. So let's talk about this concept of a tissue. A tissue is a group of similar cells working together to perform a function. In animals, there are four kind of classifications of tissues. There is epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. And then there are subsets from these four major types of tissues. Now, an organ is two or more tissue types working together to perform a function. So, for example, if we were to take a look at the small intestine, the small intestine actually has a layer of epithelial tissue that is surrounded by a layer of connective tissue, surrounded by a layer of muscle tissue, and then there's nervous tissue kind of interspersed within that as well. So you can see that there are these multiple tissue types that ultimately work together to make this organ that performs a specific function for the body. Now, in a previous lesson, we talked about the parazoa, which are also the porifera, or the sponges, and they do not have true tissues or organs. And their cells can actually disaggregate and reaggregate. So they can actually kind of like rearrange their cells. So they don't have true tissues, but they do have some specialized cells that can be rearranged to kind of function like a tissue, but it's not a true tissue. It doesn't really fit the specific definition of a tissue. But all other animals are classified as eumetazoa, which means that they do have the distinct tissues. And this differentiation is irreversible, meaning that once a cell has become or differentiated into, let's say, an epithelial cell, it cannot be reverted back to a different kind of cell. Talking about bioenergetics, we'll start with talking about the basal metabolic rate, or the BMR. This is the average amount of energy used by an organism in a non-active state, so basically at rest. And we need to do a quick review of the first and second laws of thermodynamics, because that goes into play with regards to this basal metabolic rate. So the first law of thermodynamics is that energy cannot be created or destroyed, but it can be transferred and transformed into different forms. And so this is basically the concept behind cellular respiration, right? So cellular respiration is able to take energy from nutrients and basically convert that into energy that is stored in the molecule of ATP. The second law of thermodynamics comes into play because these energy transformations and transfers are not 100% effective, and some energy is lost in the form of heat. Usually, the rule of thumb is actually about 90% of energy does not make it to the transformation to the next thing that it's supposed to be in. About 90% of it is actually lost as heat. So you can think about this concept when you put fuel or gas in your car. And the gas has stored energy. It's got potential energy stored in its chemical bonds. And then your engine in your car is able to take the stored energy in the gas and convert it into the mechanical energy of moving the wheels of your car so that it drives. But when you drive your car for a while, if you get out and touch the hood of the car, it's hot to the touch. And that's because during that conversion, the a lot of that energy was lost as heat. So only about 10% of the gas you put in your car actually goes towards driving your car. The other 90% is given off as heat into the environment. The basal metabolic rate of organisms is based on a couple of different factors. So first of all, we're focusing on endothermic animals here, and these are the ones that we also kind of just call them warm-blooded. So these are animals that are able to maintain a homeostatic or a set internal body temperature. And smaller endothermic animals have to have a higher BMR than larger animals. And that's because they have more surface area to volume ratio. So they basically are just less efficient at holding in heat. So on the previous slide, when we talked about the heat that's given off as molecules or as energy is converted from one form to another, with the car example, that energy or that heat is just kind of lost energy, which kind of stinks. But in endothermic animals, that heat is not considered a waste product. It's actually what helps us to stay warm. So if you look at this small mouse right here, it has a higher surface area to volume ratio than the elephant does, meaning that it is more likely to lose heat to the environment because of that increased amount of surface area per unit volume. Now, it doesn't have more overall surface area than the elephant. It's all about this ratio, okay? So it's all about the amount of surface area per amount of volume. So larger animals, because they have less surface area per unit volume, they're able to retain heat better, and so they can have a lower metabolic rate. Active animals are also going to have a higher BMR than inactive, and that makes sense because they need more energy. They need to be able to convert their nutrients into energy faster.